I love the book. Go ahead. I couldn't believe it. I read every word.
You know, I wish I should really have gotten the French too and tried to do a little comparison. My French isn't fluent really enough, but it would be interesting just to see. You know, there was one thing at the end of the book.
It's a guy by the name of Rabbi Levi. A young guy.
And I wondered if it was a translation. I thought it was an interesting. Oh yeah, it's French. Yeah, it's French. Yeah, he's a French. Yeah, he's very well. Yeah, so he has this at the end. You caught this. He says it's this bit of the author. And then he says as well as a deep attachment planted in humus and sand. And I thought humus and sand is like. Does that mean also Middle Eastern or sounds like it African? Anyway, no, that was good. But I don't think he would not be prefer. I don't think he is. I don't know. That's what so I wanted to get a copy of the French. I'm sure. I guess the translator.
Another word for this besides.
I don't know. That's what I was going to have to say. See if there's a copy of the French or a copy of the French.
Very interesting book.
Isn't it? Okay, yes, I hope we can.
But you know what I found? Usually I skip some descriptions when I read.
Yeah,
I didn't miss one word because it felt like a movie screen was in front of my eyes with all the words. I saw everything that he was writing about that. You know, we all knew the story, but it's American view.
So that's how did I get this book? Okay, so let me tell you, I know.
Hold on.
Yeah, okay, because
Are you going to talk about it?
yeah, I'm going to talk about everything, and I hope maybe we can, I don't know, have a discussion too after a little bit instead of.
Yeah,
it's
of course.
so much nicer than just me sitting here. And, yeah, I'll tell you all about
so much in that book.
And it's a little book, you know.
Yeah.
In my old age, one day, I like to do little books around the patients to read them.
The mayor of.
Oh, the mayor of Dorval. It was in the Suburban a couple of weeks ago. It was the solutions, the problems of the population, and it was so referring to what. That's why I took it out. So okay. So let me just get to. I read it. Oh, Edward Toll. Oh yeah, isn't he? Gentleman in Moscow. And yeah.
Oh, I'm with you. Okay. My son was in town.
Microphone?
Yes, please.
2 weeks ago, like
No. Whatever's there is all we got. Sorry.
All right.
Good afternoon, ladies. Should I wait for
Well, just for people to sit down with their coffee.
They showed me a picture. I want to leave it to
Talking about that Italian, I went to the Italian thing.
you know the name?
I went to the last meeting at the Italian thing, so I went to the
Not yet. Yeah, they watch online. You're famous on the internet.
You forget that.
I love this book.
It's from the violence, it's from the
You know, it's funny because I'm reading a book right now called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's about Indigenous people actually in the States. It's a collection of essays. It's gorgeous, beautiful writing. The woman who wrote it is a biologist, and but she's also from, I think it's called the Potawatomi tribe or whatever. And she just writes exquisitely. Yeah. What's it? Braiding Sweetgrass. Braiding?
Braiding or A-I-D?
Yes. Sweetgrass.
Like hair.
Like braids?
Yeah. So it's kind of funny. I was reading that, and I didn't realize until yesterday that when I got the email that you were doing this book today. So I managed to get it and read it very quickly, and I just loved it. It's my first Inuit book. Sweetgrass. There's also a beautiful book a workbook for young people. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass for Young Adults with illustrations. It's just gorgeous and questions to think about. So it's a big book though. Braiding Sweetgrass is a big,
It's essay, or
it's essays. Yeah. I don't know that it would work for here.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm
Because
not
it's very
just
big.
as a suggestion, if
Yeah, just because I guess I sort of thought, this is so ironic, I mean, I don't often read Indigenous literature, and here I am, reading a couple things in the same few days.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies. I'm going to start. So, welcome, everybody, and from what I hear from the comments that you enjoyed the book, found it interesting. How did I come to find it? I guess I should be a little embarrassed because I hadn't heard of it before. Maybe it just shows you the two solitudes, or at least my solitude in Quebec literature, because he's a very well-known, Michel Jean is, first of all, he's a well-known journalist and media personality. I don't watch TV altogether, but he's an announcer. I think he's the weekend announcer on TVA, the French news channel. So he's been a journalist for many years. He's also been an author for many years. I think this is his, so it depends, I got different, like 8th or 9th novel. He's written other books as well. Maybe it's his 8th novel, and they're different, like on different subjects. It's not that long ago he said that he decided to write about his Indigenous roots, and that's what the books Kukum and Afterwards are about. So how did I happened upon it at the library, another library, but there was a new bookshelf, and I was looking through titles, because I'm always looking through titles, I'm looking for interesting ideas, and I saw this book, and I saw that it had a sticker on it that it's Quebecois literature, and it was short, which saying in my old age, I'm starting to like shorter books now, and so I said, oh, okay, and I took it and I read it, and I thought, oh, this would be very interesting. I really enjoyed the book. It was just told in such a beautiful voice, and it talks about a subject which is very much au courant, and as I saw this article a couple of weeks ago in the Suburban, I don't know if anybody noticed it, but it's also the mayor of Dorval is addressing at a meeting. He's saying that things are very, very bad now in our community vis-a-vis the Innu population, which is growing in Dorval. This is not downtown when you go downtown and you see people on the streets, and this is in Dorval, and he said, and there have been incidents there, very unfortunate incidents of people, especially recent, not that long ago, 2 women, one night after the other, hit by cars when they're walking outside, and when they did, and they were killed. And the coroner's report revealed that both of the victims were in a state of intoxication at the time of their death. So it's something that's happening in the streets of Montreal, which, you read the book.
I saw it just yesterday. I was at Cabot Park.
Cabot Park, that's the thing.
And a woman there was totally drunk, and there was more than one. Several women drunk, but one of them started screaming, and it was smelling of alcohol all over.
So that's become, and that's what
Cabot Park, it's opposite the
Cabot Atwater Library.
Those women are mostly Cree, I think. They're mostly Cree. They're not Inuit. Yeah, it's a very sad situation. I have heard actually from someone who works with these homeless women that some of them end up in Montreal by this very strange kind of situation where they come here for medical treatment. There's nothing much happening up north, so they need medical treatment. They come down, and somehow they don't get a ticket to go back home. So a lot of them end up on the streets here. It's some very strange story. I can't remember. A number of years ago I heard about this, but it just seems so ridiculous. That these people, they end up, having to leave their families, come here, they're all on their own.
Completely on their own.
They're completely on their own. They're released from hospital, and they don't have the resources to get
back home. Anyway, let me just, the book itself, Kukum, which means we find out, which means grandmother in Innu. Pardon?
She's in French.
That is right, grandmama, and yeah. So, although he said, as I was listening to a few different interviews with Michel Jean, and he said we called her Grandmama Siméon, because we had a grandmother too, and she was his great-grandmother. So this book is a fictionalized version, and it's definitely fiction. He tells the story, but it's based on, loosely or however not loosely based on the life of the author Michel Jean's own great-grandmother. So according to if you do the math and you get to the end of the book, he has that small chapter at the end. Did everybody read the book, by the way? So, okay. So a few of you didn't. All right. So let me maybe just sum it up briefly for those of you who didn't read it and tell you what it's about. It's the fictionalized story of a woman whose name is Almanda, not Amanda, but Almanda, because he says at the end of the book, where he says, my grandmother is buried in the cemetery, and on her tombstone, there's a mistake on her name. They wrote it Amanda instead of Almanda, which he says, it used to bother me greatly when I was young. How could this have happened, this terrible thing? But now that I'm older, okay, it doesn't bother me, and I realized because they called her Manda. So, the common name would be Amanda, but her name was Almanda, Almanda, and she was an orphan raised by, and now she calls the people who raised her, they appear briefly in the story as ma tante and mon oncle, my aunt and my uncle. But it seems that they were not her aunt and her uncle, not her biological aunt and uncle. They were an older couple who it seems had no children of their own, and out of good Christian, they were good Christians who did what the right thing was to do, and they adopted this orphan. So she was an orphan, and she is living with this older couple in a small town called Pointe-Bleue in the Saguenay region. And so if you figure out, so what is the time frame of the story? When you get to the end of the book, he has this little chapter which could very well be fictitious. The chapter where it says Ireland, 1875, and it has a little description. This is after the whole story is over, and the story is told in first person singular voice, and it's the voice of this Almanda Siméon. She is telling her story, so it's from her point of view until the very last chapter, and that's this chapter that says Cobb, Queenstown, Ireland, 1875, and it's a little chapter that describes a young couple getting onto a it's not even a steamship, it's a freighter, with their 3-year-old daughter going to the New World, and they're going to end up in Quebec because the situation in Ireland, the economic situation is so dire, even though the potato famine is supposedly coming to an end, but things economically were very difficult, and this young couple had a business, a drapery business, and it wasn't going well, so they decided to try their luck in the New World. This young husband and wife and a 3-year-old daughter, and they make their way across. The parents both die of typhus, and the little girl is left on her own. So and I'm not, again, it's fiction, so I don't know, but I was thinking that he probably would keep the date correctly. If it was 1875 and the little girl was 3, it would mean she was born in 1872, right? So that's when the story is taking place. Well, when she talks to us, she tells us that when she was 15 years old, she falls in love. There's this great romance in this book. She falls in love with a young Innu man. I mean, he's 18 years old, so he's really just a boy, just 3 years older than she is. And he asks her to come away with him to his community. She marries him at the age of just having turned 15, so that would make it 1887. right? If she was born, I mean, I'm going if this was the real date of her birth, 1887. And that's when she, as this young 15-year-old Almanda, she joins this Innu community. She marries the 18-year-old and she joins his family. And for the rest of her life, she lives as an Innu woman. Now, he says to us at the end, also in an author's note, that my mother told us my great-grandmother's, his mother's grandmother's story, and it seems like it's a bit unclear where she really did come from. So, not so sure that this Irish bit, that could be his author's fictitious imagination. But in any case, the main point seems to be that she was an orphan, and she was not Innu, and she had blonde hair and blue eyes, and yet she joined and lived with the Innu community with her husband's Siméon clan, and they had another name before everybody had to francisize their names. And she tells the story of her life. She lived to the age of 97, a very ripe old age. And as Michel Jean said in an interview, the women in my family live very, very long lives, the men not so long. But the women, after their husbands pass away, they remain widows. They're one-man women, and that was just, he was saying that in an interview. So the book, Kukum, which means grandmother, and I suppose the same word is probably used for great-grandmother as well, in the Innu language. It is the story of this Almanda Siméon, this orphan raised by an older couple who are called her aunt and uncle in the book. And she falls in love with this young Innu man, and despite the cultural differences and the lack of language practice, she describes when they meet, she speaks absolutely not a word of Innu, and he speaks a little bit of French. But nonetheless, love in their case of these, two teenagers. This is almost like a Romeo and Juliet, except it had a happier, continuation of the story. And she goes on to share her life with the Pekuakami Innu community. They seem to accept her, at least the way she tells the story, as one of their own. She learns their language, she learns how to live this nomadic existence. And this is what's so fascinating about her story, because her life, and again, I don't know, he fictionalized this because he doesn't know the details other than what maybe his mother would, or maybe his great-grandmother did speak to him. He was a teenager. He said that her burial took place on the day of his high school graduation dance. That's what he said in one of the interviews. So would that be he was 17? She lived until then, his great-grandmother. So he might have had, he had a chance to speak to her. But the rest were through his grandmother and through his mother, the stories of her life. And also he's an author. And, as authors, I think smart authors do, he didn't write this as a nonfiction book, because then, that's tricky, because then you would have had to make sure that the facts were there. And so this way, when you fictionalize a story like this, you can base it on the woman, and you really feel that, much of this is, if not exactly, but the spirit of the book is definitely true to the way it was. This is why he chose to tell this story in a fictitious form, which, as I say, I think it's very smart, because also many readers, they'll pick up a little book of fiction, whereas they might not so much pick up a book if it's nonfiction. There are certain readers like nonfiction, but many don't. So this way, you learn a lot, and you get it all in the guise of fiction. Even though, in this case, I think we can be pretty sure, maybe that certain things, of course, he would never know, like, the love story between his great-grandmother and great-grandfather. Yes, he knew that it was passed down, that this was a great love story, but details of things, he wouldn't know that necessarily. But the main parts, the way of life that was described, and this I think is, becomes one of the most fascinating aspects of the story, is that, so she lived almost a century, this woman. So imagine, from if the date is the way it would, 1872, 97 years later. So what that would be, 1969. So, and she lived from, and this was the importance of this, the fact that she lived so long, is that exactly the time period that it spanned. Because in the 1870s, the indigenous population was still living, maybe not exactly the way they had lived 200 years earlier. The white men had already come. You know, Canada existed as a country then, but they still were able, and the way she describes it, the Innu community was still able, when she first joins it, to live their traditional way of life, which was they summered in Pointe Bleue, they set up their camps, and they lived in tents. Nobody lived in houses, they lived in their tents, and spent the summer months in one place. And when the winter came, they got in their canoes, or before the winter came, they got in their canoes and they went up north. And to me, who's thinking, oh my gosh, I still can't figure out how anybody didn't freeze to death in, you know, I mean, we live in houses with heating systems, and if we lose electricity for a day or two, we can barely manage. I know they knew what they were doing and it was their way of life, but it's so cold. And I was thinking, and they go even further north to be even colder, but there was a reason for it, and she describes it, and that's because that's when the hunting season was. You could hunt certain things during the spring and summer months, but then the main hunting, the hunting of the animals whose pelts and hides, they were very important, and this was how the Innu lived, using the animals that they killed, as well as drying out their skins and selling these pelts. I mean, there was a Hudson's Bay Trading Company, and the Tadoussac Trading Company was another one that he mentions in this story. So that kind of hunting could only be done in the winter, because that's when the animals would come. So that's why the Innu traveled from where basically they were in the lake that she calls with the Innu name is really Lac Saint-Jean. That's the lake, and the big river that she talks about, carved out of rock, is the Saguenay River, the beautiful Saguenay River with the fjord. So that was where they went, and they went further north. They spent the winter in their winter camping grounds hunting, and then they came back as the snow started to melt and spring set in. They would come back south again, and they had been doing this for generations. This was their way of life, and it was a very hard way of life, but they knew what they were doing, and you could see, and you get this feel, like it's such an appreciation. This little tiny book, I think, which maybe large volumes of nonfiction wouldn't do it as evocatively and as beautifully as he does here in these short chapters, told through the eyes of this woman, who not only does she fall in love with this good-looking 18-year-old Innu hunter who comes to court her with a goose, or with geese, wild geese that he's shot, and literally sweeps her off her feet and away from everything that she's known, but she also falls in love with the way of life. And so luckily for her, in 1887, when she marries Thomas Siméon and joins his family and begins to live the way his family lives, the civilization has not encroached enough yet to make a big change in the way of life. But during her lifetime, that's really what happens. Because think, from 1872 to 1969, the changes in the world, and everywhere in the world, but for the Innu population, for the indigenous population, for people that lived on the land, the changes were even more dramatic and drastic, and ended up, sadly, in what we see, what you saw on Cabot Square. Not to say that everybody has that, but the displacement of the people, and that's what he writes about. Michel Jean, so I didn't know who Michel Jean was, because I say I don't watch TV, not in English, not in French, and I don't, unfortunately I should really, but don't read so much in French. And if I wouldn't have come across this little book, and I feel like I should have had the French translation, a copy of it with me as well, because it would be really nice to be able to compare the two, and I'm sure with whatever our rudimentary French is, we could look up or read passages in both and have them there, which I didn't do. But He is a very well-known, and I encourage you, those of you who are interested, just Google Michel Jean, and there'll be some interviews with him, and you can hear him speak. So he is a very well-known figure in the Quebec media landscape. As I said, he's a journalist, he's an author, and there's a line in the book where Almanda says, you know, my husband, she was literate because she went to school until she was 15 because she lived in that outside. I mean, the older couple who took care of her, they had a farm. They were farmers, and she says too at one point that her new community, the Innu, remember when there weren't even farmers in the area. Farmers were already a newer innovation because when the Innu lived there before the white man came, they didn't farm. They hunted. And maybe they foraged in the forest for berries or what they had, but there was no farming. It's when the white men came over and they started this idea of farming because that's what they knew in Europe. So this older couple, they were farmers. The government gave land, and it was a very hard scrabble existence. As she says, she didn't grow up until, it wasn't that when she was 15, she gave up riches and luxury and a fancy lifestyle to go and live in the forest. She was living in this tiny little house where they, as she said, we didn't have meat for weeks on end. We ate buckwheat pancakes, and so this was not riches and luxury, but they lived in a house. This couple were very, very religious Catholics, and they sent her to school so she could read and write, and she loved books and she loved reading. When she meets this Thomas and marries him, he never learned to read and write, and she tells us even at the end of the book, she says he never learned to read and write. She at one point, and she gave birth to 10 children. She says, the Creator blessed me, it's interesting the way she words it, the Creator blessed me with a large family. The first daughter was born when she said we had been in the forest for 5 winters, so she was 20, she married him at 15. The second baby she describes lived for 2 weeks, and then suddenly she found him one day stiff in his little hammock, and she describes seeing her baby dead, and then she got pregnant again, and it seems from the way the novel goes that then she had 8 successive children after that. So she says, the Creator blessed me with a large family. And when they were a certain age, her oldest daughter, was actually her second oldest daughter, she says to her husband, I would like them to go to school. But that involved a change of life, because usually they would leave around the season when school would be starting, and so the Innu, the natives, they never went to school, that they went up to their hunting grounds, and that's where they spent the winter, and they came back down in the late spring or summer. So and there was no need to read or to write for them. But Almanda, that was the residual part of her living. She was still a white woman who'd lived her first 15 years in a French Catholic place where they sent her to school, and she loved to read, which her husband, the one thing he couldn't understand because he didn't read, so he didn't understand why that was important. Oral history was important. She says how they sat around the campfire, and her husband's father he was the elder of their family at the time. He would tell the stories, and they would all listen, and their traditions were passed down orally. But she wants her children to go to school, so she sends her children to school, and then the whole residential school issue comes into play, there are a couple of chapters describing how terrible that was when the government flies in on their planes and tells the community that every child between the ages of 6 and 15 has to go to school now, and it's for your own good. And the priest stands there and says, it's for your own good, it's for your own good, and we're going to take care of your children, and don't worry about anything. And off the children are taken, and they're brought back the following spring. And one spring when this happens, one of her, by this time it's Almanda's granddaughter, was 6 years old, didn't come back. And they asked the older sister, what happened to her? And she said, I don't know, she got sick and I don't know what happened to her. And then they tell her, the officials who came with the returning children say she got very sick and she died and we buried her, and so we're very sorry that this happened. I think now Michel Jean has a new book, and I think in the new book, and it's called, so I really can't pronounce the words properly, so anybody who's listening who knows how to pronounce them, please excuse me, because I was listening to Michel Jean when he was speaking on the interviews, yes, and even yesterday I listened to some more, and he pronounced the word, he pronounced it so quickly, and I knew it, it's written down, how it's spelled, and it didn't sound anything like the way he pronounced it. So I don't know how to pronounce the names, but Kukum is easy enough, that I can pronounce. Then, and Kukum was published in 2019. Then his next book, which I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's written in English, TIOHTIA:*KE. T-O-T-I-K, but which is not how it sounds. But anyway, that's how it's written if you want to look for the book. That's what I'm telling you, which is a Mohawk word. Kukum is Innu, and this Tikiake is a Mohawk word for the city of Montreal, which is interesting. So if you ever come across it, which maybe we will now or we'll pay attention, that was published 2 years later in 2021. And what it seems to me, I looked it up because I wanted to see, I don't know if it's been translated, I was reading the reviews in French, which sounded to me like a, sort of in a way, not a continuation of Almanda's story, because Almanda, her story is over at the end of this book, but whereas Kukum, it's an Almanda's story, but really and it's told beautifully and it's very interesting, her story just as a life story is interesting. But as Michel Jean said, interestingly, in an interview, he said, what I wanted to write about in this book was what happened with the modernization of life in the 20th century. And he uses this term, I don't know if it's correct in English, but I translated that as sedentism, which I've actually seen written in English, a switch to a sedentary way of life, as opposed to their nomadic way of life. He said, that's what I wanted to write about in Kukum. That's what it was about the reservations, the residential schools, and how it all came to change the lives of Indigenous people. But he said, and it's mainly this change of life as from the nomadic to the sedentary. So he said, so I was trying to think how to write it. How do I write a book about that? And as I said, he could have written a nonfiction, he could have said, just written as a journalist more, because he is a journalist as well, which I'll mention in a moment. It was interesting because the interviewers asked him, you're a journalist and you're a writer, écrivain comme, like fiction, a writer of fiction. Is that contradictory? How do you, and he said, no, not really. I mean, they're different, and and it was almost like he said, I wear two different hats when I write my journalism. It's one thing, and my journalistic career, he said, has taken me all over the world, very interestingly. He was in Iraq, and he was, he reported on places. He was not just sitting in the TVA studio here. When he was younger, he was traveling around as a journalist. But the écrivain, the writer part of him, is another part of him, and he said it's very different, because when I sit down, when you write journalism, it's one way, and when you write, and he said also, and I thought this was really interesting, he writes for television as well, he says. So, but he says, because he said, look, when you're doing TV journalism, you're writing, you have to write your stuff that you're going to be saying. You're reading you're not just making this up, unless you're, let's say, reporting from a scene of something abroad. But if you're writing, you're reading from a script as a reporter, at least what he was doing as the weekend anchor on TVA. So he says, but the writing is very different, because when I write as a literary writer, I can use language in a way that I can't use it, because if you're writing journalism, he said, if I would want to say something beautifully, you don't say that on television. It sounds really bizarre. So it's really two different ways. So, but in Kukum, really, he said, what I wanted to do was write about this change of life, of this nomadic existence that my great-grandmother put herself into when she fell in love and married my great-grandfather at the age of 15, to what it was like for her at the end of her life, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Imagine, if she really lived till 1969, and he said she was absolutely sharp until the end. So there was no dementia there, so she knew what was going on. So that's that's quite the change. So he chose to write it as a novel because he felt it would be more effective, and I think it is, because you said to me, like, it was so beautiful, and I savored every word, and I wanted to read it. And it's not just the descriptions of the mountains and the fjords and the river and the lake, which are beautiful, but it's also what happened. So, but in this next book, in this TOI, which I can't pronounce, the story is apparently about a young man, and I don't know if this was based on a true story or if this was just, because I didn't find any more reviews, about his fictional writer's imagination. The main character in that book, which came 2 years after Kukum, is the story of a young man who was banished from his Innu community for killing his violent, abusive father. So he does, he is accused of murder and convicted of murder in the community, by his community. And he is shunned, he's banned, so he has to leave. So he comes to Montreal, where he meets, it should be very interesting, I don't know if it's translated, we can look that up. He comes to Montreal, where he meets others from different Indigenous communities. So that's, we were saying that it's like, so there's Mohawk and there's Cree and there's different communities. And this Innu man, because Michel Jean comes from the Innu community, so this is the community that he knows. But this is what that next novel was about, to try and recreate a place of belonging for himself, this young man, the main character of the next book. So that was the next book, TIOHTIA:, KE. Then his most recent book, interesting, just published last year, 2023, easier name to pronounce, QIMMIK, Kimmick. And Kimmick is the name, it's a dog, it's the Huskies. It's the Innus, or maybe they're, those beautiful husky dogs that were used in hunting by the communities. And so that's his most recent story. And that he wanted to, I didn't know about this either, but he said in an interview, he said that for those of you who knew, apparently in the late 1960s, there was a killing of the dogs, of these Kimmick, in Innu is the word for them. And the Innu community accused the RCMP of dog slaughter, of slaughtering their dogs. But there seemed to have been very much, as in many instances, two sides to the story, that it was at that time that the traditional way of hunting with dogs was coming to an end largely because of the rise, the appearance of snowmobiles. And snowmobiles, say first one went up to a community, then another 4 were sent up. As I was reading about it, was very interesting. So snowmobiles came, and it was a much quicker, more efficient way to hunt than using dogs. You also didn't have to keep them fed, because the dogs were hungry and needed to be fed. Anyway, it was very interesting, that the whole interest, so I did a whole bunch of looking into that. So this little book can lead you to all kinds of other things. But in any case, so Kukum, there are 2 books that follow it, not sequels in any way, but just very interesting. So Michel Jean is a very interesting writer. Apparently Kukum enjoyed great success, the first of his books, because in the interviews he says, when she says to him, do you ever want to stop being a journalist and just write? And he said, well, and I'm not quoting him verbatim because it was all in French, but basically he said, it's a nice little sideline and I love writing, but it doesn't put enough bread on the table that I can afford to give up my day job as a journalist. But with Kukum, and interestingly, he said this, he said, my work didn't win any prizes in Quebec, and Kukum didn't win any prizes in Quebec. But I guess his agent said to him, go to France, go to Paris, there's this book festival, and it won 4 prizes in France, because there's a whole francophonie, French-speaking readers from other countries in the world, and the book won prizes. So then he became, he came back to Quebec, and he was a well-known media figure for his journalism, but then he became somebody bigger and more important on the literary scene. So I thought that was, it was very interesting, and I met somebody, like serendipitously, I met somebody last week, this young woman, youngish woman, and she said to me, I said, how are you? What are you doing these days? And she said, I'm working, I just came back from up north because now I work with artists in the Indigenous communities, and I don't know, she was at some festival, and I'm not sure where it is, Settile maybe? And she said, and I said, oh, you know, it's interesting, I just read this book, maybe, and she's francophone, called Kukum, and she said, look, and she takes out her phone and she shows me this picture of her and Michel Jean and another lady, and she said, I was with him 2 days ago at this festival. So I said, wow, and then when I was looking him up again yesterday, I looked at his Instagram page and it was that same picture that she had shown me. So I said to her, you know, you're in his Instagram picture, like if anybody's looking up Michel Jean, you're there in that picture. So she said that, yeah, he's become very well known because of it. And she said he even bought a house in France with his wife, and as a result, so I guess he's enjoying more material, like more of his books are selling, and he's doing very well with it now. Also, I looked up, because I saw a reference, Théâtre du Nouveau Monde is performing Kukum as a play. I think it starts maybe September or October. You can go online and you can look it up. He said that, in French, yeah, Théâtre du Nouveau, it's in French, but it's with Indigenous performers, and he said he's not writing the screenplay for the play, because he said, I can't do that, I don't know how to write like that, but I'm collaborating with the writers who are. But he said he is working, they're making it into a television series. Yes, so that he's writing, because he can write for TV. He said it's different but for theater he's not. So it's really going to be something. So this book that I had, just happened to pick off the new bookshelf, I'm very pleased that I happened to see it, because otherwise I wouldn't have come across it and I wouldn't have read it. So interestingly, so the epigram is a poem, by an Indigenous woman, poet, called Josephine Bacon, I think. I mean, in English it's written Bacon, but Bacon. And I think she is collaborating on the play, like the script for the play that's going to be performed in the fall. And what does this, and it's written first in Innu language, I mean in English characters, but in Innu language, which I won't read to you because it doesn't do us any good. But in English it gets translated as, I don't always remember where I come from. In my sleep, my dreams remind me of who I am. My origins will never leave me. So that's an interesting quote, because yes, so it's the Indigenous voice speaking. But if it's Almanda's also, she's the one, this blue-eyed, blonde-haired, very Caucasian, maybe Irish, or at least definitely seems from the family stories, part Irish, orphan, who became very much part of the Innu community. And so this is a very unlikely love story, but it's real. That part of the book, it wasn't fictionalized, because it's the author's great-grandmother, and he knows that she was a white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, so that part is not made up. So it's you could say an autobiographical story written in the first person. Telling this love story between this French-Canadian or Irish, whatever the story is, orphan named Almanda, and this young Innu hunter named Siméon. Very unlikely love in a time where the French-Canadian population regarded the Indigenous people as savages. I mean, that was just very clear. And the people who they had most contact with were the missionaries, and the missionaries were the one, who went places because they really firmly believed that it was a very important job to convert these savages to the true religion, which is why you had all those Roman Catholic priests there, and which is why you had the residential schools. And the residential schools in Quebec were Catholic. I know you were talking about the book that Joanna Goodman, I think this one is it to do with residential schools, this one? Or not?
No, not at all.
Okay, but she's written about that as well. So the residential schools in Quebec, they were very Catholic, but they existed in other parts of Canada as well. We know that because we did books about it also. And where it wasn't the Catholic Church, but it was the Methodist Church or the Baptist, whichever church felt that they had to take these young savages and teach them, educate them, yes. I mean, I guess they did it, this whole residential school system was not designed only for evil purposes. I'm sure that people who founded them did not have the idea that they were tormenting and torturing and doing terrible things to these children. They honestly felt that they were taking them from their communities where they were illiterate and very poor and bringing them to a place where, in an ideal situation, they would have been well fed and taken care of and loved, which, when you read the books about the residential schools, didn't seem like, I mean, maybe there were some cases, or maybe we just hear about the horrific ones, but there were horrors, and taking them away from their way of life because they felt, look, the change was coming, the future was coming, and the only way to adapt was to become literate. And if these children would live in these communities where their parents weren't educating them, what would happen to them as progress came? And in Kukum, she writes about that. This is where her perspective is so interesting, because when she first enters the world of the Innu, it's their traditional way of life, and that's what she falls in love with. Thomas, yes, but his way of life. And as she says to her uncle and tante when she meets them again, you were wonderful, you were good to me, thank you so much, but I feel free. Remember, ma tante, I was always like, I could never sit still, I could never be in one place, I was always running around and trying, send me on an errand here and there, so maybe she had ADHD too, who knows about it, but so she really, this way of life was very much for her, and it was beautiful. And then, to her chagrin, it came out that her timing, if this would have happened 100 years earlier, she would have been able to live her whole life like that. But because in the 1920s and in the 1930s, progress in the form of, and she writes in the book, the railway and the logging companies came to their land, and the way she describes what they did to the land. We only know it the way, if you've ever traveled to that area, we travel on roads, and the irony is that she tells us that, so in this little town, that eventually, so when Almanda at one point decides that she wants her children to be literate, only 1 year of school, she pleads with her husband, just 1 year, then they can go back and helping you with the hunt, but I just want them to have a basis, and she's tried herself to homeschool them, but she realizes it's not quite enough. And that bit of her white girl or white woman thing still sticks with her, and she convinces him. So her children are all literate. They get there, I don't know how many years of schooling they each get in. I mean, there were 9 of them that she sent to school. But they do that, and then as she's describing it, so she has to make the decision. So then there's a beautiful scene where they live in tents. They always live in tents. So she went from the house where she lived for her first 15 years to tents. But when she decides she wants to send her children, one at a time, however many, to school, she realizes that she has to stay in that little community of Pointe Bleue in order to send her children to school. And she can't live in a tent. So she goes to the local lumber yard where she knows the owner, and she says to him, I have to stay over the winter because I'm going to send my children or child to school, and I need to build a house. And so I have $300 to give you. Tell me what I need, and if it's more, another $300, I'll owe it to you, and I'll pay it to you. And he gives her the wood that she needs, and he tells her how to build the house. Her husband builds the house, and they have a little one-room house with no running water, with no electricity. She said we had a barrel and a tin cup outside the door. That was the water. No electricity. I mean, they were living in tents, so it's nice of her, but it has one room. And it's going to be warm, it's insulated with sawdust, and in the back are 2 little bedrooms, so Almanda and whichever child or children stay over the winter to go to school, they can live there. So she lives in a house, and she builds this house by the river. One day, Mrs. Progress knocks at her door, and it's these 2 gentlemen from the railroad, and they say to her, hello, your house is in the way, we're building a railroad, and the railroad is going to go right through your house. So you have to move. We will relocate you, we will build you an even bigger house, and looks around disdainfully at this little place that she lives in. And she says to him, being Almanda Siméon, a woman of great, courage and defiance and chutzpah, and she says, no, I'm not moving. And they don't force her. Somehow she manages not to move. The railroad, apparently, and then there's a picture at the back of the book, and the author says, this is my grandmother Almanda's house, where she lived her whole life, in that same house. The railroad literally runs, I don't know how many feet away from her house, because she didn't move, and she never moved. But towards the end of the book, she says, so there are not too many trains going by, and when the first time a train goes by, the children think that the world is coming to an end because it's so close to them, and it's so noisy, and everything is shaking, and the dishes fall out of the cupboards. But by the time number of years or decades later, they don't even have the trains going there anymore because the route isn't profitable anymore because everybody has cars. But the way she describes that, progress comes and change comes, and their way of life is coming to an end. So this nomadic way of life no longer exists. The way of life that she fell in love with, that she describes so beautifully in this book, no longer is sustainable. And her children, they all have to, everybody moves down. Well, her beloved father-in-law passes away. Her husband also dies. He dies 20 years before she's telling this story at the age of, the author has her being 97 when she's looking back on her life, and she says, Thomas left me. I mean, we know that from the very beginning of the book. We know at the beginning of the book when the story opens that her husband is no longer there with her. So she says here, or just maybe I should give you, those of you who haven't read it, the first beautiful 1.5 pages of the book. There's a map, so you know what you're looking at, except it's all with the Innu names. So, instead of saying Lac Saint-Jean or the Saguenay, she uses the Innu names. And the first chapter is called Nishk, which is the word for geese. A sea surrounded by trees, water that goes on as far as the eye can see, gray or blue according to the sky's moods, crossed by icy currents. The lake is both beautiful and frightening, grandiose, and life there is as fragile as it is intense. The sun rises through the morning mist, but the sand is still permeated with the cool of night. How long have I sat here looking at Pekuakami? 1,000, which is Lac Saint-Jean, 1,000 dark dots dance between the waves and gossip insolently. The forest is a world of concealment and silences. Prey and predators vie with each other's skill at blending into their surroundings. However, the wind ferries the din of the migrating birds well before they appear in the sky, and nothing seems able to contain their honking. Wild geese make an appearance around the times my memory with Thomas begin. We had left 3 days earlier, paddling northeast without straying from the safety of the shores. To the right, water. To the left, a line of sand and rocks looming ahead of the forest. I found myself between two worlds, in the thrall of a never-before-experienced intoxication. When the sun started to set, we maneuvered to shore in a bay sheltered from the wind. Thomas set up camp. I helped as best I could, peppering him with questions, but all he did was smile. Over time, I understood that, in order to learn, you have to watch and listen. There is no point in asking. That evening, crouched back on his heels, on his lap, the bird he had just shot. A plump specimen, he began to pluck it, starting with the biggest feathers. It's a task that requires meticulous attention, since if you go too fast, the shaft will break off and stay implanted in the flesh. It takes time. That's often the way in the woods. Once he'd rid the creature of its plumage, he ran through the fire to burn all down. Then, with the blade of his knife, he scraped the skin without damaging it or its precious fat. Then he hung the goose over the flames to roost. I made tea, and we ate, seated on the sand, facing the dark lake under a star-studded sky. I had no idea what awaited us, but at that moment I was sure that all would go well and that I had been right to follow my instincts. He spoke almost no French, and I no Innu Aingu. But that night on the beach, enveloped in the aroma of grilled meat at the seasoned age of 15, For the first time in my life, I felt I had found my place. I don't know how our people's story will end, but for me, it begins with that meal between the forest and the lake. And that's the opening chapter. And then in the second chapter, she tells us that she's an orphan, and she grew up with a man and a woman who she called ma tante and mon oncle. She says, I don't know if they loved me, but they looked after me. They died a long time ago, so she's looking back here. She says, I am no more now than an old woman who has seen too much. At least they can do nothing to you, lake of mine. You are unchanging. She's talking to the lake here. And then she goes into her story. And she tells the story of how she meets him. They go up and she describes life in the woods and what it takes, and this life that to some little non-Indigenous person sitting here in the creature comforts of Montreal seems like how anybody could do this and what a life. But she is so in love with that life, and the scenes and the descriptions are just so beautiful. And then interesting, there was an interesting part. She talks about the language. She says that it's a very difficult language to learn, because I kept thinking, how did she learn the language? He spoke a bit of French, because I guess when he had come down and they had to speak to the traders when they sold their skins, so they learned a bit of French. But she says on page 53 of the book, she says that she's newly arrived there, and she's trying to communicate. Her husband, her young husband of a few months, has gone away for a few nights, and she's there with her two sisters-in-law who one of them speaks French, the other one doesn't, and she doesn't speak any of their language, and so he can smile, and you can smile, and you can watch, and you can gesture. But then she says, my sisters-in-law conversed in what was still to me an incomprehensible song, of which I grasped no more than a word or an expression here and there. The language raised a barrier around me, and it took me a while to free myself of it. Innu Aimun is not an easy language to learn. It has only 8 consonants, 7 vowels, and 15 distinct sounds. So the inflection given to a term can change the meaning in a subtle or profound way. There is no written form, no linguist to analyze meaning, no feminine or masculine. There is only animate and inanimate. At first I stumbled constantly and made no headway, no matter how hard I tried. Eventually I understood that this is not just a different language from French, but a different way of communicating. It's a language whose form is adapted to a world in which the hunt and the seasons dictate the pace of life. The order of the words is not as important as it is in French, and the order varies depending on the circumstances. And she explains this, different words for snow. You know, they always say in, I don't know what language there is, many words for snow, that there's one word for kun is regular snow, and then it changes if it's light snow or rainy snow or wet snow. And she says, and this is her as the old woman speaking, the language is under threat today because for Innu Aimun to be spoken properly, it needs to be learned on the land. Today, young people prefer the French they're taught in school. These youngsters grow up blind to their past, orphans of their origins. But who is interested in all that nowadays, other than old holdouts like me, who see the past as the only treasure? So she comes and goes, you know, she goes between the present, when she's the voice of a 97-year-old lady speaking, to telling us, going back, and telling us the story of those early years. So the early years she tells in great detail when she wants to introduce us to the culture, you know, what it's like to hunt in the first winter and the first spring and that whole season. And then it speeds up in a way, interestingly, and the way I think progress sped up. And that's when the railroad comes in. And there's one funny scene. Oh, and then what connected it to this article that I saw in the Suburban is that she, when the railroad comes in and the residential schools or their children get taken away and their way of life is changing, and this is in the 20s already that started, and then it's the 30s and there are incidents, and as she says, people didn't know what to do anymore. The men, they had nothing to do. They were sitting there and they didn't know how to keep themselves occupied. And there was alcohol, and they turned to alcohol, and they drank, and they argued, and they fought, and beat their wives, things that had never happened before. her, and it was a terrible thing. And people got drunk, and she described scenes of in this town. So then the town, which then this Pointe Bleue becomes a reservation, and it has an Indian name, which is where Michel Jean says he's from. He was born in a hospital in Alma, but he's from Makashush, I don't know how to pronounce it. But that was what the Pointe Bleue was called in her story. And she says, so then the people are living there, and they don't go away to their hunting grounds in the winter, and they don't have anything to do. So the women work on beading and crafts and making moccasins. And my husband and some of my sons became tour guides. They became guides to wealthy Americans. Oh, because she says, and so what came into our territory? The railroad, the logging companies, and tourists, and tourism. So they get jobs employed as guides around, taking them there, the native guides, they know the terrain, so when wealthy hunters and fishermen fly in, they take them around. That's a way of making some extra money. She says, one of my sons builds these beautiful canoes that are wealthy people, if they want to order a real authentic canoe or real authentic snowshoes, this is what they do instead. She said, I always hated the word crafts because it has this kind of connotation that bothers her, but she said, to me, it connects me to my past. This is my past, the past that she has taken upon herself. But at one point, there's a scene, which I could just imagine this in the television series or in the play, where Almanda says that a couple and people are hit by cars because automobiles come in the town. There are no sidewalks in their town, and little children are hit by cars. They're playing in the street because they didn't have any concept. They lived in tents. There was no concept of street, so there was still. So now, if they lived not in tents only, some lived in houses, but there were no sidewalks. This was it was just area. And after 2 children are killed by cars, Almanda decides to take things into her own hands. She buys herself a ticket. Remember that scene? And she travels all the way to Quebec City. She's never been to Quebec City in her life. Imagine. So she goes, determined woman, all the way. She goes and she appears at the office of Premier Marcel Duplessis. That's his age, because she says him by name. And so that's it. So in one of the reviews, they said, so we don't know, and I don't know, and he didn't answer. I wish somebody would have asked him that. Is that real? Did they really? Did somebody, was that part of the family lore that your grandmother went and sat in the premier's office? So I don't know.
In the book, it says they go to the streets.
Well, so maybe that's how it came. I don't know. I don't know if that's how it came about. But in the book, the author has Almanda taking the train a long journey to Quebec City. She finds out where the premier's office is. She goes and she plunks herself down and she tells the secretary, I have to see him. And the secretary, who are you, lady? You can't just come and see the premier. 3 days she sits there, goes back. At night, she has her tent with her. She camps outside, because that's what she's used to. And she goes back, and finally she gets to see him. And she tells him, she said, this is terrible. The railroad has come, and cars have come, our people are dying, and we need sidewalk. And he says, I'm sorry, madame, this is not my jurisdiction, this is Indian land. And she says, yes, but as far as I can tell, this is still in Quebec, and you are the premier of Quebec, and you are in the area of the political area. She's not stupid, and she says to him, which is an area that they vote for you, so, it would be a good idea. And then, what do you know? A little while later, some men appear, and sidewalks are put down in their town. So that's a funny anecdote. Again, I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's how she tells it. So it continues until, and she tells, and she talks about how their way of life is. Yeah, that's it. This is towards the end. Maurice Duplessis leans back in his chair and he says to her, what can I do for you, madam? And she says, you came all the way here to tell me that you need sidewalks? And she says, well, the railway passes where we live. Oh, that's a long haul. And she says, not that long. Anyway, so in Pointe Bleue, that nothing had changed when I got back. Children played on deserted streets. I told everybody about my trip. They were fascinated. I told them all my stories about what the sumptuous Chateau Frontenac looked like and the terrace and the river and everything. And a few weeks later, trucks carrying heavy loads of wood showed up at Pointe-Bleu, and we got sidewalks. Then she tells us in the 1950s they finally closed down the Fort George Catholic Residential School that our children had been sent to, but she says after 30 years the damage had already been done. And she goes on to that and she ends her narrative by saying, she talks again to her husband who's been gone for 20 years. She says to him, Thomas, you left without warning one icy morning when the disease eating away at your lungs finally carried you off in one great gust of wind, leaving me alone beside your cold body. 20 years already. I cannot believe I have lived all those years without kissing you. I have never been able to fill the void left by your absence. Yet here and now, when I close my eyes and fill my lungs with the lake's heady fragrances, I feel your hand on my cheek. And anyway, she says that it was all the love and the tenderness and the so much until the very end. Deserting me was your only betrayal, Thomas. But you were right, my love. Life is a circle and it returns me to you always. And then there's this little bit on Ireland, which is maybe supposed to be how, where she came from. If this is, and again, he says in an interview that he's not sure where she really came from. And then in a world, at the very end, he says a word from the author. And he tells us that his great-grandparents lie side by side in the cemetery. There's a mistake, that's what he says, there's a mistake on her tombstone that they wrote Amanda instead of Almanda. And then he says here, in fact, there are several versions of my Kukum's ancestry. Some claim she was born in Nitassinan of an Innu mother, that her father, a French-Canadian, wed an Irish woman for his second marriage, which would have led to confusion. Every story is equally valid. I have relied on the tale my mother has told me ever since I was a child. So I guess that was one. Then he talks about the cemetery. He has a picture here of him as a young man. There's a group picture in the book. So he intersperses, once you have a few photos in the book, which are actual photos of Almanda Siméon, of one of her children, and here the author himself and his cousins, and his mother and grandmother and great-grandmother. And he says that my youngest brother has blonde hair, I have black hair, and my other brother and I have black hair. And he says, but I like to think that it is from her that I inherited my love for books, and perhaps the adventurous spirit that has served me so well in my profession as a journalist. So anyway, it's a lovely little book if you haven't read it. It doesn't take too long. One day, you immerse yourself in it, easily done, and a good way to do it because then you have the feeling of it. And it opens, at least in my mind, I mean, I've heard, you've heard about the residential schools, heard about all these things, but the perspective from this young, 15-year-old girl who goes off and lives with this and how she views it, I thought it was very, very beautifully done. If you could read it in the French, it's probably even more beautiful, although supposedly the translation is good. It's hard to say unless you can compare the two. Well, unless you were good in both and you could sit and compare them. But anyways, it said that it was a good one. So, end of that. Questions, comments? Thank you. Yeah?
I just wanted to say that as I was reading it, I felt so sad for them. I mean, we knew the story, we knew the history, but no one ever, the Indigenous people, you have to redo their lives and so. And I felt, when I was reading, I had a whole different perspective. I thought, I feel so bad for, they loved their way of life.
That's it.
Leave it alone. They loved it.
The
railroad.
You see that's it. That's progress and that's all the way. But they really, it was such a different way of life. And and we're still today, they're suffering so much because they I'm not everybody, I'm sure not, but can't seem to find a place. Although Michel Jean, seems to, he's doing okay. He's maybe the exception because he's very talented and he found his way as a journalist. He went to Université de Montréal, he has a degree in whatever, and a degree in journalism and a nice career. But when you hear him interviewed, so one of the interviewers was also, I think, Innu, because they were talking to each other in Innu. I'm assuming it's Innu, I don't know what language he would be speaking. but in their own language, and then they switch to French, and then they go back to Innu. So he learned it somehow, even though he says it's very hard to learn.
Yeah, I read something, they're trying to bring that language, the Indian language shouldn't be.
I would imagine they probably are, because now things, and you know, he said that in some of the interviews, he said, when I started writing a number of years ago, there wasn't really so much interest in what I'm writing about. And he says, but now I feel that there's a change, that people are interested, and especially young people are very interested. And he was surprised that when he went to Europe, the interest in his book, and you know, in ancestry, maybe that's it, and indigenous people.
And was he part of the residential school system?
No, it seems not. No. His grandparents' generation, because it was his great grandmother who sent her children. I mean, they were a range of children, but no. So no, he went to regular, as he said. You know the difference that my my grandmother was born there in the tents outside, and I was born in a hospital in Alma. Like that's already modern. He was born in 1960, just to figure out how old he is. But yeah, yes.
I just wondered, when did